The story of the Protestant Reformation did not begin or end with one man. In 1517, Martin Luther lit a spark that challenged centuries of religious tradition. That spark crossed borders. In Switzerland, Huldrych Zwingli carried the movement forward, proving that the call for reform had become more than the voice of a single monk. It had become a movement that was reshaping Europe. But every movement reaches a moment when it needs someone to give it structure, someone to turn a protest into a lasting foundation. That man was John Calvin, a quiet French scholar, a refugee, a man who never planned to lead a city. In 1536, while fleeing his homeland, Calvin stopped in Geneva expecting to stay for only one night. He had no idea that this brief stop would change his life and the course of Christian history forever. The scholar who wanted a life of peace and study would become one of the greatest architects of the Protestant Reformation, influencing churches, nations, and generations long after his death. But how did that happen? Let's find out. Before we continue on this journey together, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Chronicle in English, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode in our Reformation series. Your support helps us continue bringing history to life. Long before John Calvin became one of the leading voices of the Protestant Reformation, he was simply a boy growing up in the French town of Noyon. He was born on July 10, 1509, into a family that valued education and ambition. His father, Gerard Calvin, was not a priest, but he served as an administrator for the local cathedral and worked closely with church officials. Through his position, he was able to give his son educational opportunities that many children could only dream of. At first, Gerard expected John to pursue a career in the church. While still young, Calvin received church benefices, sources of income intended to support future clergy, and began preparing for theological studies. John proved to be an exceptional student, quiet, disciplined, and deeply curious. He developed a love for languages, literature, and careful reasoning. His teachers quickly recognized that he possessed an unusually sharp mind. And this was also the age of the Renaissance, a major cultural and intellectual movement that was reshaping Europe. The Renaissance stood for a rebirth of learning, especially the recovery of classical Greek and Roman ideas, literature, art, and scholarship. It encouraged people to study language more carefully, think critically, and look back to ancient sources for wisdom. In many ways, it changed the way society viewed education, religion, politics, and human potential. That movement had a real influence on Calvin's education. The Renaissance emphasis on classical learning helped shape the kind of student he became. It encouraged the study of Latin, rhetoric, philosophy, and careful interpretation of texts, all skills that would later become central to his work. So while Calvin was being educated in France, he was also being formed by the wider intellectual spirit of his time. But then, everything changed. For reasons historians still discuss, Gerard altered the course of his son's future. Instead of theology, he instructed John to study law. Obedient to his father's wishes, Calvin left Paris and continued his education at the universities of Orleans and Bourges, where he immersed himself in legal studies. At first, the decision may have seemed like a detour. In reality, it was preparing him for something far greater. The discipline of law taught Calvin how to analyze arguments, organize ideas, and write with remarkable clarity, skills that would later distinguish him from many other reformers. Meanwhile, beyond the lecture halls of France, Europe was changing. By the early 1530s, the ideas of the Reformation had spread far beyond Germany. Martin Luther's writings were being read across Europe and in France. Many people were beginning to question long-established religious practices. Small groups of believers met in secret, reading the Bible for themselves and discussing the need for change. The French authorities, however, viewed the growing movement as a serious threat. John Calvin found himself caught in the middle of these changes. Although the exact details of his spiritual journey remain uncertain, Calvin later described experiencing a sudden change of heart that led him to embrace the Reformation. From that moment, he devoted himself to studying the Scriptures and defending the faith he had come to believe. His new convictions came at a cost, as opposition to the reformers increased in France. Those associated with the movement faced growing danger. The crisis came in 1534 with the affair of the placards, when anti-Catholic posters were suddenly pasted on doors, walls, and public places across France. These placards attacked the Mass and accused the Catholic Church of serious corruption. One was even placed near King Francis I's own chambers, turning what had been a bold protest into what the king saw as a direct insult to his authority and to the unity of the kingdom. Francis I reacted with fury. He ordered a harsh crackdown on suspected Protestants, and arrests, interrogations, and executions followed. The atmosphere in France became far more dangerous for anyone linked to the Reformation. Calvin knew it was no longer safe to remain, leaving behind his homeland. He became a refugee, fleeing to Basel in Switzerland, carrying little more than his learning, his faith, and a determination to continue writing. During this period of exile, at just 26 years old, Calvin completed a remarkable book. It was called Institutes of the Christian Religion, published in 1536. The book was dedicated to King Francis of France. Calvin hoped to explain what the reformers actually believed, and to defend those who were being persecuted for their faith. The book set out the central ideas of the Reformation in a clear and powerful way. Calvin argued that the Bible, not church tradition, was the highest authority in matters of faith. He stressed that salvation came by God's grace alone, not through human effort or religious rituals. He also challenged many Catholic teachings and practices, including the authority of the Pope, the use of saints, and the idea that the Church should control access to God's truth. At the heart of the book was a strong belief in God's sovereignty, the seriousness of sin, and the need for a disciplined Christian life shaped by Scripture. The book was clear, carefully organized, and deeply rooted in Scripture. Unlike many writings of the time, it presented the teachings of the Reformation in a systematic and accessible way. Scholars, pastors, and ordinary readers across Europe quickly recognized its importance. In France, where Protestants were under pressure, the book gave believers a sense of direction and courage. In cities such as Paris, Lyon, and Basel, it circulated among educated readers and reform-minded Christians. Its influence did not remain local for long. As it was copied, translated, and reprinted, it reached far beyond one city or one country, spreading through Switzerland, France, and eventually much of Europe. Not everyone welcomed it. To supporters of the Reformation, the book was a bold and brilliant defense of the faith. To Catholic leaders, it was dangerous and deeply unsettling because it challenged the religious order they were trying to preserve. But even those who opposed Calvin could not ignore the force of his argument or the clarity of his writing. The young refugee who had fled France was no longer an unknown scholar. His name was beginning to spread throughout the Reformation. Yet Calvin had no plans to become the leader of a city. He longed for a quiet life of study. But on a journey through Switzerland, one unexpected stop would change the course of his life and the history of Geneva forever. Before John Calvin ever set foot in Geneva, the city was already caught in a struggle that was both religious and political. For many years, Geneva had lived under the influence of the Roman Catholic Church and the authority of its bishop. While also resisting the pressure of the Duke of Savoy, the city's religious life was still shaped by Catholic worship, traditional ceremonies, and the old church order that had governed it for generations. But beneath that outward stability, many citizens were becoming restless. They wanted reform, greater independence, and a church that would speak more clearly to the spiritual needs of the people. That unrest did not appear by chance. It grew stronger as Geneva's political crisis deepened. The threat from the Duke of Savoy created fear in the city and pushed many people to think more seriously about both their freedom and their faith. The agitation for Protestant reform was closely tied to this crisis. As Geneva struggled to defend itself against outside control, many citizens began to see that religious reform and political independence were connected. If the city could break from Catholic control, it could also strengthen its own identity and protect its future. Across Europe, the Protestant Reformation was spreading. and Geneva was not untouched by its influence. Reform ideas entered the city through preachers, travelers, and the growing dissatisfaction of those who believed. The Catholic system had become corrupt and spiritually empty. Geneva's reformers also looked to the Swiss Protestant cities, especially Zurich, for support. When the danger from Savoy increased, Geneva turned to Zurich for help. Zurich agreed to support the city in its struggle, but the agreement came with a clear condition: Geneva must become Protestant. In other words, Zurich's help in the political and military crisis was tied directly to the city's religious reform. That support gave the reform movement new strength. The people of Geneva now saw that their fight was not only about defending the city from Savoy, it was also about choosing the faith that would define the city's future. The agitation for Protestant reform grew stronger because the political crisis made reform seem both necessary and possible. Geneva was no longer simply resisting outside power. It was moving toward a new religious identity. The turning point came through the bold preaching and leadership of Guillaume Farel. Farel was one of the most passionate Protestant reformers in the region. He did not arrive in Geneva as a quiet scholar or a careful diplomat. He came as a fiery evangelist, determined to pull the city away from Rome and into the Protestant cause. His preaching stirred the people, challenged the old order, and helped push Geneva toward reform. With the support of the wider Protestant movement and the backing of Zurich, Farel's message found a city ready for change. Under his influence, Geneva officially embraced the Reformation in 1535, rejecting the Catholic Mass and moving decisively into a new religious direction. But the victory was incomplete. Geneva had broken from Catholicism, yet it had not fully built a stable Protestant church. The city had enthusiasm, but it lacked structure. It had reform, but not enough order. It had broken with the old system, but it still needed pastors, discipline, teaching, and a clear theological foundation. The people had turned away from Rome, but they still needed help learning how to live as a Reformed Christian community. That was the gap Guillaume Farel saw when John Calvin arrived. In the summer of 1536, Calvin was on his way to Strasbourg. His plan was simple. After years of uncertainty and exile, he wanted a quiet place where he could read, write, and continue his studies in peace. Geneva was never meant to be his destination. He stopped there only because war had made the usual travel routes unsafe. To Calvin, Geneva was only a place to spend the night before continuing his journey. But Farel believed otherwise. When he learned that the young author of Institutes of the Christian Religion was in the city, he immediately sought him out. Calvin politely refused to stay. He explained that he was not a preacher or a political leader. He simply wanted a life devoted to study. Farel would not accept that answer. According to Calvin's own account, Farel spoke with such urgency that he warned, "You are following your own will, not God's. For if you refuse to help us in this work of the Lord, God will curse your studies." Calvin was deeply shaken. Years later, he admitted that the encounter felt like a divine summons. Instead of continuing to Strasbourg, he stayed in Geneva. It was a decision he had never planned to make, yet it would change the city, the Reformation, and the course of his own life forever. Farel had helped bring Geneva to the point of reform, but Calvin was the man needed to give that reform shape, discipline, and lasting strength. Working alongside Farel, the quiet scholar who had wanted nothing more than a desk full of books was about to become one of the most influential leaders in Christian history. John Calvin had not come to Geneva to lead a revolution, but almost immediately, he found himself helping to build one. Working side by side with Guillaume Farel, Calvin set out to transform a city that had embraced the Reformation but was still searching for direction. The old religious system had been rejected, yet many people were uncertain about what should replace it. Calvin believed that reform was not simply about changing church doctrines. It was about shaping an entire Christian community. One of his first tasks was to help prepare a confession of faith, a statement outlining the essential beliefs of Geneva's Reformed Church. City officials expected citizens to affirm these teachings as a sign of their commitment to the new religious order. Calvin also wrote a catechism for children, believing that lasting reform depended on teaching the next generation. Instead of leaving religious instruction to chance, he wanted children and new believers to understand the foundations of the Christian faith from an early age. But perhaps his most significant contribution was helping establish a system of church discipline. that would later become known through the ecclesiastical ordinances. These ordinances defined the responsibilities of pastors, teachers, elders, and deacons. They were intended to provide structure for the church and encourage accountability within the Christian community. Calvin believed that a healthy church needed more than passionate preaching. It also needed clear organization, consistent teaching, and leaders who would care for both the spiritual and practical needs of the people. This was where the disagreement began. The Reformers wanted the church to have real authority in matters of faith and discipline. They believed that people who lived carelessly or refused to obey Christian teaching should be corrected, and in some cases barred from the Lord's Supper. The city council, however, did not want the church to have that much control. Many officials felt that such decisions should remain under the authority of the city, not the ministers. In other words, the conflict was not simply about religion. It was about who would have the final say in Geneva, church leaders or civil leaders. Not everyone agreed. Some citizens felt the reforms were moving too quickly. Others resisted the expectation that the church should play such an active role in shaping public life. Disagreements soon developed between the reformers and the city council, especially over church discipline and the celebration of the Lord's Supper. The tension continued to grow. Within 2 years, the conflict would reach a breaking point. The very city that had welcomed Calvin and Farel would ask both men to leave. What had seemed like the beginning of a lifelong mission was about to come to an abrupt and unexpected end. In 1538, John Calvin and Guillaume Farel left Geneva as exiles. For Calvin, the departure was painful, but it also came as a relief. He had never wanted to lead a city. Now, he believed he could finally return to the quiet life of study he had always desired. Instead, God seemed to have another plan. Calvin traveled to Strasbourg, one of the leading Protestant cities in Europe, where he was warmly welcomed by the respected reformer Martin Bucer. Bucer became more than a colleague. He became Calvin's mentor. Under Bucer's guidance, Calvin learned valuable lessons about pastoral care, church leadership, and working patiently with people who did not always agree. These years helped transform him from a brilliant scholar into a more experienced church leader. While in Strasbourg, Calvin served as pastor to a congregation of French refugees who had fled religious persecution. It was also during this period that he married Idelette de Bourret, a widow whose quiet support brought stability to his demanding life. Far from wasting his years in exile, Calvin continued writing and expanded institutes of the Christian religion, strengthening the work that had already earned him respect across Europe. Meanwhile, back in Geneva, things were not going as many had hoped. Without Calvin and Farel, the city struggled to maintain unity. Religious disagreements continued, discipline weakened, and several civic leaders began to realize that removing the reformers had not solved Geneva's problems. One by one, influential voices began calling for Calvin's return. The invitations became more urgent. At first, Calvin refused. He remembered the conflict, the opposition, and the painful way he had been forced to leave. But the requests did not stop. Eventually, after much prayer and careful consideration, he agreed to return, but only on the condition that the church would be allowed to carry out its ministry with the structure and discipline he believed were essential. When John Calvin returned to Geneva in September 1541, he did not come back seeking revenge against those who had expelled him. He came back with a vision. During his years in Strasbourg, he had learned that lasting reform required more than passionate preaching. It required stable leadership, clear laws, faithful pastors, and a community willing to live out its beliefs. Almost immediately, Calvin began organizing the church under a new framework known as the ecclesiastical ordinances. The ordinances defined the roles of pastors, teachers, elders, and deacons, giving Geneva's church a structure that would endure for generations. One of the most influential institutions to emerge was the consistory, made up of pastors and elected lay elders. The consistory met regularly to oversee matters of church discipline and encourage moral and spiritual accountability. It could admonish members of the church and, in some cases, suspend people from receiving communion. Though civil punishments remained the responsibility of Geneva's government. To some, these reforms brought order and stability. To others, they felt too strict. Calvin believed that faith should influence every part of life, not only worship on Sunday, but also honesty in business, care for the poor, family life, education, and public conduct. Because church and civic life worked closely together, many historians describe Geneva during this period as a theocracy, though the city continued to be governed by elected civil councils, rather than by Calvin alone. His influence was substantial, but he was not a king or a dictator who ruled by himself. Despite continuing disagreements, Geneva began to change. Schools expanded, including the founding of the Geneva Academy in 1559, which trained future pastors and scholars. The city became a refuge for thousands of Protestant refugees fleeing persecution, especially from France, England, Scotland, and parts of Italy. Many of these newcomers were skilled craftsmen, printers, merchants, and teachers. Their talents strengthened Geneva's economy, enriched its intellectual life, and helped turn the city into one of Europe's leading centers of printing and learning. Books produced in Geneva traveled across the continent. Pastors trained there carried Reformed ideas back to their own countries. The small Swiss city that Calvin had never intended to call home was becoming an international center of the Protestant Reformation. As Geneva prospered, not everyone welcomed the new order. Among John Calvin's strongest opponents was a political faction known as the Libertines. Many were influential families and civic leaders who believed the consistory had gained too much influence over the lives of ordinary citizens. They argued that the church should have less authority in matters of public morality and personal conduct. Calvin disagreed. He believed that a reformed church could not survive without discipline, accountability, and a close partnership between the church and the civil government. For years, the conflict divided Geneva. Political debates became increasingly heated. Sermons were interrupted, Calvin was publicly insulted, and his authority was repeatedly challenged. At times, it seemed as though the Reformation in Geneva might collapse from divisions within its own supporters rather than from outside enemies. The struggle reached its climax in 1555, after losing political influence. Some leaders associated with the Libertines attempted an uprising against Geneva's government. The revolt failed. The city's civil authorities quickly restored order. Several leaders were executed after trial, while others fled Geneva or were banished from the city. From that point onward, organized political resistance to Calvin's reforms largely came to an end, allowing the Reformed Church in Geneva to continue, developing with far greater stability. Yet another controversy would forever become part of Calvin's legacy. In 1553, a Spanish physician and theologian named Michael Servetus arrived in Geneva. Servetus had openly rejected the doctrine of the Trinity and questioned infant baptism, teachings that were considered essential by both the Roman Catholic Church and nearly all Protestant reformers of the time. Because of his writings, he had already been condemned by Catholic authorities and sentenced in absentia. When Servetus unexpectedly entered Geneva, he was recognized, arrested, and brought before the city's civil court. Calvin took part in the theological proceedings and argued that Servetus's teachings were dangerously false. The judges found Servetus guilty of heresy. The final sentence, however, was imposed by Geneva's civil council. On October 27, 1553, Michael Servetus was executed by burning. The event has remained one of the most debated episodes of the Protestant Reformation. Many modern historians criticize the execution as a violation of religious freedom. At the same time, they point out that in 16th century Europe, both Catholic and Protestant governments commonly treated heresy as a civil offense punishable by death. Understanding that historical context does not remove the tragedy of the event, but it helps explain the world in which it occurred. Despite continuing criticism, Calvin never abandoned his work. He preached several times each week, trained future pastors, wrote influential commentaries on much of the Bible, and maintained correspondence with reformers across Europe. Even as illness weakened his body, his determination remained unchanged. On May 27, 1564, John Calvin died at the age of 54. In keeping with his own wishes, he was buried in an unmarked grave. He never wanted people to honor a monument to him. Instead, he wanted the focus to remain on the scriptures. He had spent his life studying and teaching. Today, the exact location of his grave is unknown, but the influence of his ideas is impossible to miss. The quiet scholar who once longed for a life hidden among books had become one of the most influential figures in the history of the Protestant Reformation. His voice had fallen silent. His influence was only beginning. John Calvin rarely traveled after returning to Geneva. Unlike Martin Luther, he did not spark the Reformation. Unlike Huldrych Zwingli, he did not lead public debates that transformed a city. Instead, Calvin built something that could outlive him. Geneva became a place where pastors, teachers, and refugees gathered from across Europe. They came not only to find safety, but also to learn, to study, and to prepare for ministry before returning to their homelands. Many of them carried Calvin's teachings far beyond the walls of Geneva. In France, they became known as the Huguenots. Despite severe persecution, they established Reformed churches throughout the country, and Calvin remained in regular correspondence with many of their leaders, encouraging them through letters and trained pastors. In Scotland, one of Calvin's most influential students was John Knox. After spending time in Geneva, Knox returned home and became the leading figure of the Scottish Reformation. The Presbyterian tradition that emerged in Scotland was deeply influenced by the church structure Calvin had helped develop. Calvin's influence also reached England. During times of religious persecution, many English Protestants found refuge in Geneva. There they encountered Calvin's teaching and produced the famous Geneva Bible, first published in 1560. Its study notes made it one of the most influential English Bibles of the 16th century, and it became especially popular among English Puritans. His ideas spread into the Netherlands, where Reformed churches grew rapidly and became an important part of Dutch religious life. Over the centuries, Calvin's influence extended far beyond Europe. Reformed and Presbyterian churches were established across North America, Africa, Asia, and many other parts of the world. Historians continue to debate aspects of Calvin's theology and leadership. Some admire his discipline, scholarship, and organizational genius. Others question his strict approach to church life and point to controversies such as the trial of Michael Servetus. Yet on one point, there is little disagreement. John Calvin helped shape the course of Protestant Christianity in ways that continue to be felt centuries after his death. Whether one agrees with all of his ideas or not, there is little doubt that Calvin left a profound mark on world history. His story reminds us that history is not shaped only by kings, generals, or warriors. Sometimes it is changed by scholars, by teachers, and by people whose greatest weapon is the power of an idea. But the Reformation was still far from over. While Calvin was transforming Geneva, another conflict was unfolding across the English Channel. This time, the question would not begin with a monk or a scholar. It would begin with a king whose personal decision would separate an entire nation from Rome and give birth to the Church of England. That is the story of Henry VIII and the English Reformation, the next chapter in our journey through the history of the Protestant Reformation. If you enjoyed this documentary, please like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe to Chronicle in English so you don't miss the next episode. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep discovering the stories that shaped our world.